One cold and windy night in the middle of winter, a policeman in Charleston found a young girl crouching in a doorway. She was wearing nothing but a flimsy silk nightdress, and she was shaking and shivering with the cold. Her eyes were wide, and she stared vacantly at the policeman. He had to carry her down to the police station and put a blanket around her shoulders to warm her up. When she was able to speak, the young girl told a very strange story. She was only 18 years old, and she had grown up in a small country town. One day, when she was walking down the street, she was stopped by a man who was very handsome and well-dressed. He told her how beautiful she was and gave her compliments about her eyes, her mouth, her nose, her hands, her legs, and even her feet. He told her he was a photographer and he could make her a famous model. The man was so persuasive and persistent that she believed him. Lured by his promises and fooled by his compliments, she went with him to the city. He booked a dingy room for her in a cheap, run-down motel and helped her carry her bags upstairs. As she unpacked her things, he said goodbye and closed the door behind him. The girl undressed and got ready for bed. Just then, the door opened and the man came back. "You forgot to give me a goodnight kiss," he said. The girl was embarrassed. All she was wearing was a silk nightdress. She walked over and kissed him on the cheek. Suddenly, the man grasped her in his rough hands and began kissing her lips and slobbering all over her face. She was frightened and tried to push him off, but no matter how she struggled and squirmed, she couldn't break free of his grip. She was just a small, thin girl, and he was a strong and powerful man. "Please let me go," she begged. "You're hurting me." "Never," growled the man with fiendish glee. "Not even the devil himself could save you now." In an instant, the man suddenly stopped and stared over her shoulder. He let out a hoarse, choked cry. His grip loosened, and he stood shaking and looking at something behind her. The girl heard a muffled rumble like rolling thunder, and the room was filled with a cloud of smoke and soot. The man's face turned pale and he staggered back, frothing at the mouth. He fell to the floor and began frothing at the mouth. His body started shaking and convulsing. It was as if he was having a fit. Speechless with terror, the girl fled from the room without looking back. She ran down the dark hallway, down the dingy staircase and out into the street. She had cowered in a doorway for almost an hour before the policeman discovered her. After listening to the girl's story, the police went straight to the motel. In a room on the second floor, they found the body of a man. He lay stretched out on his back, as dead could be. He was a ghastly sight. His face was twisted in anguish and horror. His mouth was wide open, and his eyes stared blindly at the ceiling. The room smelled of sulfur, and the furniture was caked in black soot. Scattered across the floor there were ashes, and in them the police noticed the imprint of 2 huge naked feet. The young girl was sent home to her parents, but the police were never able to figure out how the man had died. This is the true story of a haunted hotel room in Oregon. The hotel owners have tried to hush up the story for fear that Noon will visit their establishment, but the name of it is the Oregon Caves Chateau. A woman was driving back to her home in California from Washington to California. It was late evening, and snow had begun to fall before she finally reached the little Oregon town where she planned to spend the night. Tired and ready for a hot meal and a good night's sleep, she stopped at the first place she came upon. It was an old hotel on the main street. The lobby had a musty odor. The seedy clerk behind the desk signed Herin. Her room was on the 3rd floor, room 310. An elderly bellhop helped her with her luggage. As soon as the door was opened, a blast of hot air struck the woman full in the face. With the hot air came something else, something she could not define but that filled her with dread. It was heavy and depressing, she explained, with the strong scent of thievel, a euro. She felt as if she was about to faint. All she said was, "It's awfully hot. Haunted hotel room, 310 haunted hotel room, 310. This is a genuine photo of the haunted hotel room in question, room 310. The bellhop tinkered with the radiator knobs. Then he opened the window and left. The room began to cool off, but the feeling of despair and dread grew stronger. It centered on the open square of black window space. The terror seemed to speak in her mind. She thought she could sense a voice whispering to her, compelling her to do something terrible. "Go to the window," it said. "Throw yourself out." She couldn't seem to resist the urge to jump out the window to what she knew would be certain death. She clawed at the bedsheets, trying to restrain herself from walking towards the open window. Terrified, the woman eventually summoned the strength and crawled out of the room. She rushed down to the lobby and shouted to the staff that she couldn't stay another minute. She explained, "I was sure that if I stayed the night, I'd be dead by morning." She was prepared to sacrifice the money she'd already paid just to leave, but when she went, the clerk never asked what was wrong or if she wished to try another room. He returned the full cash amount to her. She checked into another hotel and had planned to be on her way early the next morning. Instead, she decided to stay over a day and look into the history of the old hotel to see if she could discover the reason for her terrifying experience there. She visited the local library to make a few inquiries. An elderly librarian sat behind the desk. "I'm just wondering," the woman said tentatively. "Did anything shocking ever happen in the old hotel?" The librarian looked at her strangely. "How did you come upon that bit of history?" she asked. "It took the hotel a long time to squash the story." The librarian went on to tell what had happened. One evening back in 1948, a couple checked into the hotel as Meister and Mrs. Oscar Smith. The next morning, hotel employees found the young woman's body lying on the sidewalk outside the hotel beneath room 310. The man who had registered as her husband had disappeared. At first it was ruled suicide, the librarian concluded. But then they pried open her fist and found it clutched a handful of dark curly hair, not her own. So they made a search for the murderer, but he was never found. "By the way," the librarian suddenly added, "isn't that a coincidence? It all happened on November 5th, 40 years ago yesterday." They say the Grey Man always appears on Powellis Island before a deadly storm. He warns of impending danger for the small island and its residents. He appears as a shadowy figure dressed in all grey clothing, standing on the beach or among the sand dunes, waving to people before suddenly vanishing in front of their eyes. People who see the man in grey and heed his warning always survive the storm. They say he saves lives because he was unable to save his own. He was once the son of a rich man who owned the Pelican Inn on Pawleys Island. One evening, he was going to visit his girlfriend who lived on the other side of the island. He had just returned from a long voyage at sea and planned to marry her. The young woman waited and waited for him to arrive, but he never came. As the young man was travelling down the road, he was so eager to see his girlfriend that he took a shortcut across the marsh. His horse stumbled and fell, throwing him off. When he tried to stand up, he realized that he was standing in quicksand. Despite his best efforts, he wasn't able to free himself, and he died a lonely death, sinking beneath the sand. The young girl was devastated by the terrible news. It almost drove her mad, and she spent countless hours walking forlornly along the beach in Pawleys Island, mourning her lost lover. One windy afternoon she was out walking when she saw a man dressed all in grey. He was looking out over the water. As she got closer, he started waving at her. She felt her stomach tighten because she recognized him. It was her dead fiancé. She couldn't believe her eyes. Suddenly, a wave burst from the sea, enveloping him. When it had gone, the grey man had disappeared. The young woman was terrified, and she told her family what she had seen. Her parents thought she was losing her mind, so they took her to see a doctor on the mainland. That night, a hurricane struck the coast and the ocean was tossed by the waves. They called it the Great Hurricane, and its violent winds destroyed nearly every home on the island. The next day, when the girl and her parents returned, Pawleys Island was in ruins. Over 300 people had lost their lives, most of them dragged out to sea by the rolling waves. There was wreckage strewn all around, but the girl's house was somehow left strangely untouched by the storm. It was as though it had been protected by an unseen force. She was convinced that her dead lover had returned to save her from a horrible fate. Ever since then, the Grey Man has been seen before every major storm, warning people to take shelter. In 1893, a family saw the Grey Man silently waving at them. They fled the island and survived a hurricane that killed an estimated 1,500 people. In 1954, a newly married couple went to Pawleys Island for their honeymoon. One day, they spotted a man in grey. He was dressed in rumpled grey clothing and a grey hat which hid his face. Suddenly, the man disappeared. The couple left the island, and a hurricane struck soon after, killing 95 people and destroying 15,000 homes. In 1989, a husband and wife were walking along the beach in Pawleys Island when they saw a man all dressed in grey appear from among the dunes. As they approached him, he suddenly vanished. The couple knew about the legend, so they promptly packed their bags and fled inland. A hurricane struck the coast, killing 76 people along its path. So if you ever take a vacation on Pawleys Island, keep one eye on the beach and look out for the grey man. If you see him waving at you, take heed of his warning. It might just save your life.